What happens when a calm morning talk show conversation suddenly turns into one of the most uncomfortable moments on live television? Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The cameras roll as the hosts of The View sit around the table, smiling the way they always do when a big guest walks out. The audience applauds loudly as Kerry Washington steps onto the stage, waving and greeting the crowd. She hugs a few of the hosts before taking her seat at the table. Whoopi Goldberg leans forward with her familiar grin. Well, look who's here. Kerry Washington is back at the table. The audience cheers again. Kerry laughs warmly. It's so good to be back. I feel like every time I come here we end up having a real conversation. Whoopi chuckles. That's the goal around here. Sometimes it gets a little too real. That line gets a few laughs from the audience. Joy Behar jumps in. You've been everywhere lately. New projects, producing, activism. When do you sleep? Kerry smiles. Honestly? I don't. I'm running on coffee and passion. The audience laughs. Sunny Hostin nods. You've also been very vocal about social issues, especially representation in Hollywood. Kerry straightens a little in her seat. Yeah, for me it's always been about making sure stories reflect real people. Not just one kind of person, but all kinds. There's applause from the audience. Sunny continues. And you've produced several projects focused on that. Yeah, Kerry says. Because if you're lucky enough to have a platform, you should use it. Everything still feels light, comfortable, exactly like a normal segment. But then Alyssa Farah Griffin leans forward. She smiles politely, but her tone shifts the direction of the conversation. Well, Kerry, I think a lot of people admire that, Alyssa says. But there are also viewers who feel that celebrities sometimes lecture everyday Americans about issues they don't fully understand. The audience makes a small murmur. Kerry tilts her head slightly, still calm. What do you mean by that? Alyssa keeps her tone measured. Well, there's this perception that Hollywood lives in a bubble. And when actors speak about politics or social issues, some people feel like it comes across as out of touch. The table grows quieter. Whoopi glances briefly between them. Kerry takes a breath before responding. I actually hear that argument a lot, she says. But I always find it interesting because actors are citizens too. We vote, we live in communities, we care about what happens in our country. The audience applauds. Alyssa nods. Of course. I'm not saying you can't have an opinion. But, Kerry asks gently. A few people in the audience laugh nervously. Alyssa continues. But I think sometimes when celebrities speak, it can feel like they're telling people how to think. Joy raises her eyebrows slightly. Sunny leans forward. But Kerry answers first. I don't think sharing an opinion is the same as telling someone how to think. Applause breaks out again. Alyssa nods again, but presses further. I understand that. But I also think people get frustrated when very wealthy celebrities talk about struggles that regular Americans are dealing with. Now the energy shifts. You can feel it. Kerry's smile fades just slightly. Well, let me say something about that. The room grows quiet. I grew up in the Bronx, Kerry says calmly. My parents were public school educators. My life didn't start in Hollywood. The audience claps loudly. Alyssa nods politely but responds. And I respect that. But you've also had incredible success and influence. Yes, Kerry says. And I'm grateful for that. She pauses. But success doesn't erase where you come from. The audience reacts again. Whoopi tries to keep things balanced. That's true. But Alyssa continues, still calm. I think the bigger question people ask is whether celebrities should be shaping public conversations about policy. Now the audience starts murmuring louder. Kerry looks directly at Alyssa. Are you saying artists shouldn't speak about issues they care about? Alyssa raises her hand slightly. No, I'm saying sometimes it can feel one-sided. Joy suddenly laughs. Welcome to television. The audience laughs loudly. But the tension is clearly building now. Kerry nods slowly. I actually agree that conversations should include different perspectives, she says. Alyssa looks relieved for a moment. But Kerry continues. The problem is when certain perspectives are dismissed as Hollywood opinions instead of just opinions. That gets a big reaction from the audience. Sunny nods firmly. Exactly. Alyssa responds quickly. But it's also fair for people to question whether celebrities understand their day-to-day realities. Kerry leans forward slightly now. And it's fair for people to question politicians, commentators, and media personalities too. The audience claps again. Alyssa smiles tightly. That's true. Whoopi senses the rising tension. Well, This is turning into Hot Topics Part 2. The audience laughs again. But Kerry isn't finished. I just think it's interesting, she says, her tone still calm but more serious now, that when artists speak about issues like education or voting rights, suddenly the conversation becomes about whether they should be speaking at all. Sunny nods strongly. That's a good point. Alyssa shakes her head slightly. No, I think the conversation is about influence. Kerry replies immediately. Everyone at this table has influence. The audience applauds loudly. Joy raises her hands. Guilty. The room laughs again, but the tension remains. Alyssa leans forward again. But Kerry, influence also comes with responsibility. Kerry looks straight at her. I completely agree. There's a pause. Then Alyssa says something that makes the audience go quiet. But sometimes the messages coming out of Hollywood are very one-sided politically. You can hear someone in the audience whisper, "Oh." Kerry's expression changes slightly. Not angry, but focused. Well, she says slowly, that depends on what you consider one-sided. Whoopi leans back in her chair. Oh boy. The audience laughs nervously. Kerry continues. For example, advocating for equal rights, fair representation, and voting access shouldn't be considered partisan issues. The audience claps loudly again. But Alyssa responds immediately. Some people do see them as political. Kerry pauses. Then she asks a question that shifts the entire mood at the table. Do you? The audience gasps lightly. Even Joy looks surprised. Alyssa hesitates for a moment. And suddenly the conversation that started friendly now feels like something much bigger is about to unfold on live television. There's a brief pause at the table after the question lands. The audience is quiet now, the kind of silence that only happens when everyone senses a real moment unfolding on live television. Alyssa Farah Griffin shifts slightly in her chair before answering. I think some people do see them as political issues, she says carefully. And I think part of the challenge right now in the country is that everything gets framed politically. Kerry Washington nods slowly. But that didn't answer the question, she says, still calm. The audience lets out a soft, oh. Whoopi Goldberg immediately jumps in with a half laugh. All right, we're not cross-examining each other yet. The audience laughs nervously, easing the tension just a little. But Alyssa smiles and answers. Okay, fair enough. Personally, I think issues like voting rights and representation matter a lot. I just think the conversation around them sometimes becomes very polarized. Kerry nods again. Polarized because people disagree, or polarized because certain voices are questioned more than others? The audience murmurs again. Joy Behar leans back in her chair with a grin. Oh, this is getting spicy. People laugh, but the tension at the table remains. Alyssa responds. I think it's polarized because people feel like they're being told what to believe. Kerry shakes her head gently. But again, that assumes someone is telling them what to believe. Speaking about something isn't the same as forcing someone to agree. There's applause from the audience. Sunny Hostin jumps in. Exactly. Conversations are supposed to include different voices. That's literally what this table is about. The audience applauds again. Alyssa nods. I agree with that. But I also think viewers sometimes feel that certain perspectives dominate the conversation. Joy raises an eyebrow. On this show? The audience laughs loudly. Alyssa laughs too. Well, not just here. I mean in entertainment media generally. Kerry leans slightly forward now. But entertainment media also includes millions of different voices. Alyssa shrugs. Sure, but there's still a perception that Hollywood leans strongly one way politically. Kerry pauses. Let me ask you something honestly, she says. Alyssa nods. Of course. Kerry continues. Why is it that when artists speak about equality or fairness, the response is often that they're being political? The audience claps again. Alyssa answers carefully. Because sometimes those issues get framed through political policies. Sunny shakes her head. But equality shouldn't be controversial. More applause. Alyssa responds quickly. I'm not saying equality is controversial. Joy jumps in. Good answer. The audience laughs. Alyssa continues. I'm saying the way people talk about it can feel political to some viewers. Kerry nods slowly. I understand that. But I think sometimes that argument becomes a way to silence voices. The audience reacts with louder applause. Whoopi raises her hand slightly. Okay, we're not silencing anybody today. But Kerry continues calmly. No, and I appreciate that. I'm just speaking generally. Alyssa leans forward. And I appreciate that too. I actually think these conversations are important. Kerry smiles faintly. They are. There's a brief moment where the tension softens again. Then Alyssa adds something that brings the temperature right back up. But I do think sometimes celebrities underestimate how their words land with people who feel ignored by the system. The audience goes quiet again. Kerry nods slowly. That's a fair concern. Alyssa looks slightly surprised. Kerry continues. I actually agree with that part. Now the audience murmurs in curiosity. But, Kerry adds, I think there's another side to that. Joy grins. There's always a but. Laughter breaks out again. Kerry continues. Sometimes people assume celebrities can't understand struggle anymore. She gestures slightly toward the audience. But artists come from everywhere. Different backgrounds, different communities. Sunny nods. That's true. Kerry continues. And when someone uses their platform to talk about issues that affect those communities, it shouldn't immediately be dismissed as Hollywood talking. The audience applauds loudly again. Alyssa nods slowly. I'm not dismissing it. Kerry responds. I know you're not personally, but that narrative exists. Alyssa takes a breath. I think part of the frustration is that some viewers feel like their concerns aren't represented in Hollywood conversations. Joy shrugs. That's because viewers aren't one group. The audience laughs. Joy continues. You've got 50 different Americas watching the same show. Whoopi nods. That's the truth. Alyssa looks back toward Kerry. But when someone with a huge platform speaks, it reaches millions of people. And sometimes viewers want to hear more balance. Kerry tilts her head. What does balance mean in this context? Alyssa answers. Different viewpoints. Sunny jumps in again. But the show literally has different viewpoints. The audience claps again. Alyssa laughs slightly. Yes, and sometimes we argue about them. Joy gestures dramatically. Sometimes, big laughter fills the studio. But Kerry looks thoughtful. I actually think disagreement is healthy, she says. Whoopi nods. Absolutely. Kerry continues. But what concerns me is when disagreement turns into questioning whether someone should speak at all. The audience claps again. Alyssa responds quickly. I'm not saying you shouldn't speak. Kerry nods. I hear that. There's another pause. Then Alyssa says something that catches everyone's attention. But I do think celebrities sometimes underestimate how powerful their influence is. Kerry looks at her. That's why we try to use it responsibly. Alyssa replies. But responsibility also means understanding that not everyone sees the world the same way. Kerry nods. That's true. Then she adds calmly. But understanding differences doesn't mean staying silent. The audience applauds loudly again. Sunny nods enthusiastically. Exactly. Alyssa responds. And I'm not asking anyone to stay silent. Joy chuckles. Good, because that's not happening here. The audience laughs again. But Kerry suddenly asks another pointed question. When commentators talk about political issues on television every day, nobody asks them to stay silent. The audience reacts again. Alyssa smiles slightly. Well, that's literally their job. Kerry nods. And storytelling is mine. There's a loud burst of applause. Whoopi leans back again, shaking her head with a smile. See, this is why people watch this show. The audience laughs. But the moment between Kerry and Alyssa still feels charged. Alyssa leans forward once more. I just think sometimes the conversation gets framed as if one perspective is morally correct and the other isn't. The audience quiets again. Kerry's expression becomes more serious now. That depends on the issue. Alyssa raises her eyebrows slightly. How so? Kerry pauses for a moment before answering. Well, some issues are about basic rights. The audience applauds again. Alyssa responds carefully. And most people agree with basic rights. Kerry nods. Then why do we still debate them so much? The audience reacts with another wave of murmurs and applause. Joy looks around the table. Oh boy, we're really doing this today. Whoopi glances toward the producers off camera. You can tell nobody's cutting to commercial yet. The audience laughs. But the tension between the two women hasn't faded. In fact, it's becoming clearer that this conversation is no longer just a polite disagreement. And everyone in the studio can feel that the discussion is heading toward an even more intense moment. The audience is still reacting when the room settles again, the kind of quiet that happens when everyone realizes the conversation has gone far beyond the usual morning talk show chat. Kerry Washington sits forward slightly in her chair, her hands resting calmly on the table. Across from her, Alyssa Farah Griffin watches closely, listening but clearly preparing her next point. Whoopi Goldberg glances around the table with a half smile. Well, this is why we don't rehearse these conversations, she says. The audience laughs lightly, but the tension in the room hasn't disappeared. Kerry continues speaking, her voice measured. I think the reality is that when certain issues come up, voting rights, representation, equal opportunity, people sometimes frame them as political debates. But for many people, those things are just basic parts of living in a fair society. The audience applauds again. Sunny Hostin nods strongly. That's exactly right. But Alyssa responds almost immediately. I don't disagree with the values, she says. I think where people struggle is when the conversation suggests that if you disagree with certain policies, you're somehow against those values. The audience murmurs. Kerry looks at her thoughtfully. That's an interesting distinction. Joy leans forward slightly. Joy Behar says with a grin. Now we're getting into the philosophy of it. Laughter ripples through the audience. But Kerry continues. Let me ask you something honestly, Alyssa. When people talk about fairness or access to voting, do you feel like the conversation is accusing people who disagree with certain policies? Alyssa nods slowly. Sometimes, yes. Kerry listens without interrupting. Alyssa continues. I think what happens is the debate becomes framed in a way where one side feels morally judged. And when people feel judged, they stop listening. The audience murmurs again. Sunny shakes her head slightly. But we also can't ignore real problems. Alyssa nods. I'm not suggesting we ignore them. Kerry responds calmly. I don't think you are. There's a short pause. Then Kerry adds something that shifts the conversation again. But I think what often gets lost is that people speaking up about these issues aren't doing it to judge others. They're doing it because they care deeply about communities that are affected. The audience applauds again. Alyssa nods. And I respect that. She pauses before adding. I just think when celebrities speak, sometimes the message can sound like there's only one acceptable viewpoint. Joy laughs lightly. Well, this table proves that's not true. The audience laughs again. Whoopi leans forward. That's literally the point of this show. Alyssa smiles. And that's why people watch it. Kerry nods. And I'm glad we can talk about it openly. But then Alyssa says something that immediately catches everyone's attention. I do think, though, that sometimes Hollywood conversations can unintentionally dismiss the experiences of people who feel left out of those discussions. The audience murmurs again. Kerry tilts her head. How so? Alyssa continues. Well, a lot of Americans feel like cultural conversations happen without them. And when they hear celebrities speak about their struggles, they think, our struggles look very different. There's a quiet ripple of agreement from parts of the audience. Kerry nods thoughtfully. That's actually a really important point. Alyssa looks slightly surprised again. Kerry continues. I think it's true that people's experiences vary widely across the country. Sunny adds. Absolutely. But Kerry continues speaking, still focused on Alyssa. However, acknowledging different struggles doesn't mean ignoring others. The audience applauds again. Alyssa nods. That's fair. Kerry gestures gently with her hand. For example, when I talk about representation in entertainment, I'm talking about an industry that historically didn't include many voices. The audience applauds again. Joy jumps in. And we all watched that change happen over decades. Kerry continues. And that change happened because people spoke up. Alyssa responds. And I think that's a positive thing. Kerry nods. But speaking up also invites disagreement. Whoopi raises her hand slightly. That's the part people forget. The audience laughs. Alyssa continues. And disagreement is healthy. Kerry agrees. I completely agree. There's a moment where it feels like the conversation might calm down. But then Alyssa adds something that shifts the mood again. I just think sometimes when someone questions the approach, they're immediately labeled as being against the cause. The audience reacts with a mixture of murmurs and scattered applause. Kerry looks directly at her. Do you feel that happens to you? Alyssa pauses for a second. Then she answers honestly. Sometimes, yes. The audience goes quiet again. Sunny leans forward slightly. Well, sometimes criticism of ideas gets interpreted personally. Alyssa nods. That's true. Kerry listens carefully before speaking again. I think that's something everyone struggles with right now. How quickly conversations turn into personal conflicts. The audience applauds. Joy gestures dramatically. Welcome to social media. Big laughter fills the studio. Kerry smiles briefly. But seriously, I think we all need to be better at separating disagreement from disrespect. Alyssa nods. I agree with that completely. Then she adds something that once again raises the temperature of the conversation. But the reality is that cultural influence from Hollywood is enormous. And when messages come from such powerful platforms, people expect them to represent a broader range of perspectives. The audience murmurs again. Kerry thinks for a moment before responding. I understand that expectation. She pauses. But I also think it's unrealistic to expect any one person or industry to represent every viewpoint. The audience applauds. Whoopi nods firmly. That's the truth. Joy adds. We can barely represent everyone at this table. Laughter erupts again. But Alyssa continues. I'm not asking anyone to represent every viewpoint. I just think conversations should acknowledge that people outside entertainment might see things differently. Kerry nods slowly. That's fair. There's a pause. Then Kerry adds calmly. But people inside entertainment also come from those communities. The audience applauds again. Sunny nods. That's an important reminder. Alyssa leans back slightly, thinking. I think what we're really talking about is trust. The table grows quiet. Kerry asks, what do you mean? Alyssa answers. People trust voices they feel understand them. The audience murmurs thoughtfully. Kerry responds. And sometimes trust grows when people speak honestly about what they believe. The audience applauds again. But Alyssa looks at her and says something that suddenly brings the tension back to the surface. Do you think there's room in Hollywood conversations for perspectives that challenge the majority viewpoint? The audience gasps lightly. Joy raises her eyebrows. Whoopi leans back in her chair again, already sensing where this might go. And Kerry pauses for a moment before answering, clearly aware that whatever she says next could push this discussion into an even more intense moment on live television. There's a long pause after the question. The audience inside the studio grows noticeably quiet, and several people lean forward in their seats. The moment feels heavier now than it did at the start of the segment. Kerry Washington takes a breath before answering. I absolutely think there's room for different perspectives, she says calmly. Across the table, Alyssa Farah Griffin watches carefully. Kerry continues. But I think there's a difference between challenging perspectives and dismissing experiences. The audience reacts with a mix of murmurs and applause. Whoopi Goldberg nods slowly. That's an important distinction. Alyssa responds. I agree with that. But she adds another thought. I just think sometimes people who challenge the dominant cultural conversations feel like their voices get pushed aside. Sunny Hostin jumps in. But that happens everywhere, not just in entertainment. The audience claps. Sunny continues. Every industry has debates, disagreements, and competing viewpoints. Alyssa nods. That's true. Kerry leans forward slightly again. I think what matters is how those disagreements happen. Joy tilts her head. Joy Behar says jokingly, preferably without anyone flipping the table. The audience bursts into laughter, breaking the tension for a second. Whoopi laughs too. Please don't flip the table. The network would not like that. More laughter fills the studio. But Kerry returns to the point. I believe disagreement can actually strengthen conversations if it's respectful. Alyssa nods. I completely agree. Kerry continues. And honestly, I appreciate that we can have this conversation here. The audience applauds again. Alyssa smiles slightly. So do I. There's a brief moment where the tension softens. But Whoopi raises a finger and adds with a grin. Now let me ask something before the internet explodes later today. The audience laughs loudly. Whoopi continues. Kerry, do you think artists sometimes get put in a position where they're expected to comment on everything? Kerry laughs softly. Oh, absolutely. The audience laughs with her. She continues. There's definitely pressure to speak about every issue. Joy nods dramatically. That's social media for you. Kerry continues. But I think most artists speak about the things that personally matter to them. Alyssa responds. And I think that authenticity is what people connect with. Kerry nods. Exactly. There's another short pause. Then Alyssa adds something reflective. I'll be honest, Kerry. I think the reason these conversations become heated is because people care deeply about the country. The audience murmurs. Kerry nods. I believe that too. Sunny adds. Even when people disagree strongly. The audience applauds again. Alyssa continues. And when people feel like their voices aren't heard, they push back harder. Kerry thinks for a moment. That's true. Then she says something that gets another big reaction from the audience. But that's also why more voices speaking up, not fewer, is important. Applause fills the studio again. Joy claps along with the crowd. See, that's the answer. Whoopi laughs. Joy solved it. The audience laughs loudly again. But Whoopi then glances toward the producers off camera. All right, I'm hearing we have about a minute left before the break. The audience groans playfully. Joy raises her hands. Of course, right when things get interesting. Kerry laughs. That's television. Whoopi turns back toward Kerry. Before we go, what do you hope people take away from conversations like this? Kerry pauses for a moment before answering. I hope people see that disagreement doesn't have to mean division. The audience applauds. She continues. We can ask hard questions and still respect each other. More applause. Alyssa nods. And I agree with that. Sunny smiles. That's the goal. Whoopi points toward the audience. And that's why these folks show up every day. The audience cheers loudly. Whoopi then looks toward the camera. We'll be right back after this break. The studio music plays briefly as the cameras pull back. The hosts continue chatting quietly while the audience applauds. But even after the cameras cut to commercial, people in the studio are still buzzing about what just happened. Some audience members whisper to each other about the moment when Kerry asked Alyssa directly if she personally saw those issues as political. Others talk about how the conversation managed to stay intense without turning hostile. When the show returns from the break, the conversation moves to a different topic, but the energy at the table still feels slightly charged. Later that afternoon, clips from the exchange begin circulating online. On social media, viewers start posting reactions to the moment. Some users praise Kerry Washington for staying calm while defending her perspective. Others say Alyssa Farah Griffin asked questions that many viewers have been wondering about. Within hours, short clips from the discussion trend across platforms, with viewers debating who made the stronger arguments. Fans of The View share the clip widely, calling it one of the most thoughtful debates the show has had in a while. Some viewers praise the hosts for allowing the conversation to unfold naturally instead of cutting it off. Others say the discussion shows exactly why the show continues to spark national conversations. Behind the scenes, producers reportedly felt the moment captured exactly what live talk television is meant to be: real people discussing complicated issues in real time. Later interviews with audience members reveal that many in the studio appreciated that both Kerry and Alyssa stayed respectful even while clearly disagreeing. One audience member says the moment felt tense but honest. Another says it reminded them why they enjoy watching live talk shows instead of scripted debates. By the end of the day, the clip has been shared thousands of times, and viewers continue discussing the exchange online. Some viewers side strongly with Kerry's argument about speaking up on social issues. Others say Alyssa's points about how messages are perceived by different audiences deserve attention too. But nearly everyone agrees on one thing: the moment felt real. And that authenticity is exactly what keeps conversations from shows like The View circulating long after the episode ends. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Kerry Washington made the stronger points in this conversation? Or do you agree more with Alyssa Farah Griffin's perspective? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.